This is your second lecture on the religion of Judaism, in which we'll begin with the Levitical law and go through a very pivotal figure of Samuel.
The term Levitical refers to one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi, and rather than this tribe eventually being given a territory in the Promised Land, it is understood that they will serve as the priest to the people. And priests could come either from this tribe of Levi, or there was a much more ancient tradition of the priesthood that was tied directly to Moses' older brother named Aaron. A priest was very important as he served as a mediator within this tradition, leading the people through rituals such as an animal or crop sacrifice that would restore either an individual or the community's relationship with Yahweh. Many of these stories do develop as the people are wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, but we see that these rituals and laws continue to retain their importance once a permanent structure referred to as the temple is constructed, and that will eventually be in the capital city of Jerusalem. The purpose of a crop sacrifice was typically to ask for peace from God or to give thanksgiving to Yahweh for having had a very good harvest. Typically animal sacrifices, which would be a bull if you're a wealthy person or a couple of birds if you're a poor person. This animal sacrifice would be a way of seeking Yahweh's forgiveness for sins. I think I addressed this in the previous lecture, but the ancient Near Eastern tradition is the belief that the God actually lives in the skies above, and when you burn a crop or an animal sacrifice, the smoke goes into the air, and it is believed that the odor is pleasing to the God, and therefore the relationship is restored. Typically, if you're making an animal sacrifice for forgiveness, such as a whole burnt offering, the priest would have you place your hands upon the animal before the animal is slaughtered as a way of transferring your sin to that animal. And then, of course, the actual sacrifice is a very violent action, and in seeing that violence, you are reminded of the violence that your own sinful action brought into the community. And the blood shed from the animal is seen as the means of attaining this forgiveness from Yahweh. We do have one particular holy day that I would like you to have down in your notes. We've already talked about the holy day of Passover in the previous lecture, but a second very important holy day for Judaism is Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And on this day, the high priest, in the original story, that is Aaron, goes into a central place of the tabernacle, the place of worship. And the central place is called the Holy of Holies. And there in that Holy of Holies, there is an Ark of the Covenant. I have a much more decorative rendition of it pictured here than what the actual Ark would have looked like. But you can see that it's a small chest, and within this chest, many of the items and vessels that were used in worship were carried from place to place. And if you look closely, you can see that there is a rod going through two iron loops on the side of the chest. You have that same rod on the other side. And with these staffs on top of shoulders, you would carry the Ark of the Covenant from place to place. Now, not only was the Ark a chest that carried particular items used in worship, more importantly, the lid of the Ark of the Covenant with these two angelic beings that you can see atop here is referred to as the mercy seat. And the mercy seat was understood to be the throne of Yahweh. Again, Yahweh is an invisible God. You cannot have an image of Yahweh. That would be idolatry. But the idea is that the invisible presence of Yahweh sits atop this mercy seat. And so on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, the high priest would select a goat and a ram, and he would slaughter these two animals, and he would take the blood from these animals and go into the Holy of Holies, and he would sprinkle the blood on top of the mercy seat. And this was a way of seeking Yahweh's forgiveness for the sins of the entire community for that year. So this holy day of Yom Kippur, which literally means day of covering, day of atonement, is a way of having reconciliation with God for all of the misdeeds, the wrongdoings from the previous year. Now, one other interesting thing that goes with the ritual of the Day of Atonement, besides having a ram and a goat slaughtered, there is another goat that is left alive, and it is believed that the sins of the community are transferred to this goat, and he is sent out to wander in the wilderness, And there it is believed that he is haunted by a demonic presence there in the desert. The reason I mention this to you is this is where we get the term scapegoat from, the idea of transferring all of our wrongs onto someone else, and that someone else is referred to as the scapegoat. Well, in this case, literally, we have the goat carrying the sins of the community out into the wilderness. Okay, and so with that information about the Ark of the Covenant, I believe that you're covered on this slide, so we will move along now. Okay, if we pick up on the story with where we left off after Moses, Moses does die before the people cross over into the Promised Land. He delivers one last sermon that is recorded in a book called Deuteronomy. And after this, we do see the leadership transfer to Joshua, who I mentioned last time. And Joshua has an enormous ceremony at the very end of the book entitled Joshua, after they've completed the conquest and have taken the promised land from the Canaanites. Joshua gives a speech at a place called Shechem, and this is not the establishment of a new covenant, but it is a covenant renewal ceremony, reminding the people that they belong to Yahweh and they need to be obedient to Yahweh. This becomes very important because as we turn the page to the next book, we see that the people in the next generation will choose to be disobedient to Yahweh. A lot of people have never understood why, if they've now received the promised blessing from Abraham of being a huge family and having this territory, why the Israelites would turn to other gods. And so I'll briefly explain that to you before we move on with the information on that slide. It's gonna sound strange, it will sound bizarre to you. But what happened was that this was the very first time that the Israelite people, instead of wandering as nomads in the wilderness, were actually settled in a territory where now farming would become their major way of sustaining themselves. But because farming was not in their background very much, only a little bit of, I guess, what we would refer to as gardening as they move from place to place, well, now they have to try to learn how to farm in mass quantities. And they're not very good at this, and so they start to reach out to some of the Canaanites that they had driven out of the land and try to get their advice. And the advice of the Canaanites to the Israelites is that they're worshiping the wrong God, that their God Yahweh was good for military purposes and good for war, but now the people of Israel need to turn to the Canaanite God because he's the one that makes the land fertile for farming. And this God's name is Baal, B-A-A-L, and the way that you worship Baal is that you set up a small cult sanctuary, and you have prostitutes that work in this sanctuary, and men would come to the sanctuary and they would pay a fee to have sex with the prostitute. And the idea within Canaanite religion was that Baal would look down from the heavens and he would see the man enjoying sexual intercourse with the prostitute, and he would decide that he wanted to do the same thing. And so he had a goddess named Asherah, and the belief was that Baal would then have sexual intercourse with Asherah, and when Baal and Asherah have intercourse, this is a picture of fertility, and their fertility in the heavens is then extended down to the earth, and it's what makes the land fertile. So Israelite men started turning away from the worship of Yahweh, believing that he was the God for war, and they start worshiping the Canaanites. Well, as this happens, the Canaanites start to invade and move back into this land, and we have skirmishes between the Israelites and the Canaanites continuing in different territories. And sure enough, the Canaanites are able to take over different parts of the land of Israel once again. When this happens, we have the Israelites crying out to Yahweh, who they had neglected, and they cry out to Yahweh to send them a judge. Now, this is not a judge in the sense of what we picture with a black robe and a gavel, but a judge is a combination of a warrior and a liberator, someone that Yahweh will raise up within Israel who will be a very strong fighter, very strong military leader, and will drive out the Canaanites so that Israel has the land once more. And so we have several stories about these warrior delivers, these judges that help retain the land of Israel. Some of the most memorable stories are around figures such as Gideon and Samson. I'll go ahead and pick on Samson since we have him pictured here. But Samson is someone who was born to parents who did not think they would be able to have children, and they're so grateful to have this child that they take what is called a Nazirite vow over him. And a Nazirite vow means that he can never drink alcohol, and I know it will sound strange, but he cannot touch a dead thing, such as a dead animal, on purpose, because that would be intentionally making himself unclean. So no alcohol, no touching a dead thing, and probably most well known is no razor shall touch your head if you take a Nazirite vow, so no haircut. And what we see in the story of Samson is that he is bullheaded, he acts quite foolishly, but he is so strong that the primary enemy that the Israelites are facing, and you do need to get this down your notes, they're called the Philistines. Okay, the Philistines are the primary Canaanite enemy that Samson and his group of Israelites are facing. And the Philistines are fearful of Samson because of his strength. Again, the stories about him are quite saga-like. You have one story in which he becomes angry with a Philistine village, and he captures 300 foxes, and he ties them together by their tails. And in the knot between their tails, he places a fiery torch, and these angry 150 pair of foxes go charging through this Philistine village and burn it to the ground. And on another occasion, when the Philistines confront Samson, he picks up the jawbone of a donkey and he slaughters 1,000 Philistines. We do see him not being obedient to his Nazirite vow, although there's not the explicit statement of drunkenness. It does appear at a wedding when after Samson is married to a Philistine woman, that alcohol is involved there. And then we see another occasion when he kills a lion, and then later on comes across the body of the lion, and there are some bees that have made their hive inside the body of the lion, and Samson's hungry and wants some honey, so he breaks the Nazirite vow once again by reaching in and touching the dead body of the lion so that he can get some honey. Eventually, Samson will fall for a Philistine woman named Delilah, and he's having an affair with her, and the Philistine men come to her and ask her to find out the secret of his strength so they can finally defeat this Israelite who causes them so much trouble. And after a few failed attempts of her trying to discover the source of Samson's strength, he finally, on the fourth night, confesses to her that his strength is in his long hair. If he were to get a haircut, he wouldn't have his strength anymore. And so after he falls asleep, Delilah cuts his hair, and the Philistines charge in, and they capture Samson, who can not fight them off anymore because he has no more strength. And they, of course, add even more injury to him by gouging his eyes out so that he will be blind. Eventually, in prison, Samson does have his hair grow back long again, and his strength returns. And what you see pictured here is his last action. The Philistines will oftentimes bring him out as sort of a party favor or party trick to say, look, we've captured that strongest Israelite. And Samson, as he's brought out here at a festival, worshiping the Philistine god Dagon, asks God to give him strength for one last heroic act, one last act as a liberator, as a judge. And he pushes over some pillars within the building, and of course this kills himself, but also, according to the story, 10,000 Philistines are killed. Okay, we now arrive at an extremely important figure for the religion of Judaism, and a very important transitional figure. His name is Samuel. Like Samson, Samuel's mother, whose name is Hannah, is believed to have a barren womb, that she cannot have children, and so she travels down to the primary sanctuary in a city called Shiloh, and there she offers a prayer that Yahweh would open her womb. And the old priest at Shiloh, who's named Eli, sees Hannah praying, and because she's shaking so feverishly while praying, he thinks that she is drunk, and so he confronts her about this. She explains her situation, and Eli extends a blessing to her, and Hannah makes the promise that if Yahweh will give her a son, then she will actually hand that son over to Eli after he has been nursed, and he can be raised in the sanctuary here in Shiloh as someone set aside for the work of Yahweh, and with the further blessings from Yahweh that she will have other children who will remain in her home with her. And that is exactly what happens. Samuel is taken to Eli, And it immediately becomes obvious that Yahweh favors this boy Samuel. He sleeps in a very unusual place. Remember, I told you about the Ark of the Covenant, that only the high priest could go to that place one time a year, that Holy of Holies. And we find that Samuel actually puts his sleeping bag right next to the Ark of the Covenant. That's where he sleeps every night. And one night, Yahweh calls out his name several times. Samuel thinks that it is Eli calling him the first 3 times, but finally on the 4th time, after being instructed by Eli to say that he is listening, Yahweh, your servant is listening, so speak, we do have Yahweh telling Samuel that he has chosen Samuel to be his next priest, because Eli is very old now, and Eli has extremely disobedient, rebellious sons, and so Samuel will be the one that will next serve as Israel's high priest. Now, what is significant about Samuel is he has 2 other roles. He will also act as a warrior liberator, making him the very last of the judges, even though his story is not found in the book of Judges. And he also speaks the word of Yahweh to the people, which is the tradition of the prophets. And we'll say much more about the prophets in the next lecture. But Samuel serves as priest, prophet, and judge. And we do have the Philistines as the primary enemy of Israel still at this time. And in the midst of a conflict with the Philistines, we have Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, are killed, and the Ark of the Covenant, which represents Yahweh's presence with the people, is also stolen. And so when Eli hears that his sons have been killed, that the Ark of the Covenant has been stolen, he's a blind old man at this point, and he's rocking back and forth, and he rocks too far back and falls back, and he dies. And so now young Samuel is the officially recognized leader on so many fronts for Israel. He is a successful leader early on, and actually will be throughout his life, with one bump in the road that is no cause of his toward the end of his life. One of the first things he does is actually Yahweh does it, but since Samuel's the leader, he gets credit for it. We have the Philistines being cursed with a plague. It's a strange sounding plague, I know, but if you look at the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it's very specific in saying that this plague is of mice and hemorrhoids. So if you can imagine pairing those 2 together, I think that illustrates the creativity of Yahweh in this story. But because they've stolen this Ark of the Covenant, we have one night where their god Dagon, the statue of Dagon, is toppled over to make it look like he's bowing to the Ark of the Covenant. And then on the next evening, we have the Dagon statue is toppled again, but this time his head and hands are cut off, with his head cut off, saying he has no wisdom, with his hands cut off, saying he has no power. And still, because the Philistines don't understand that they have no right to this Ark of the Covenant according to the Jewish tradition, this is when Yahweh sends his plague of mice and hemorrhoids upon the people. They finally get the message, and they load the Ark of the Covenant up on a cart and send it with oxen to carry it back into Israel. And so this is really the first major event as Samuel is leader of the people, and they celebrate him as a good and wise leader. Now, Samuel, as he starts to come to the end of his life, the people of Israel, while being thankful that he was a good leader, questioned how qualified his sons are to be leaders. And they have good reason to complain here. Samuel's sons have been quite disobedient, just like Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were. Well, the people tell Samuel that they want to be like all of the other nations in the area and have a human king. And this is a new thing for Israel, because up until this point, Yahweh, their God, had been seen as their king, and the priest was the mediator between the people and their king, their God, Yahweh. But now the people want a human king. Samuel goes to Yahweh very upset by this request, and Yahweh's not happy about it either, but he says that he'll give the people what they want. They just need to be warned that when you have a human king, eventually one of the kings, and many of the kings, will probably be tyrannical despots, and they will force your sons into more and more military service, and they will kidnap your daughters from you and make them work in a royal palace. And they will also have heavy taxation upon you, so you will not be as prosperous with a human king as you could be serving Yahweh as king. And the people are given this warning, yet they still insist that they want a human king. And so we'll pick up the story there on the next lecture, as we will see Samuel anointing the very first king of Israel, a man named Saul.